A famous poetic couplet claims that Islam comes alive after every Karbala. It is a staple of South Asian mourning, but it rests on a historically shaky foundation. This cultural sentiment suggests that by the year 680, the religion of Islam had essentially expired, requiring a bloody rebirth to continue. Dr. Israr Ahmad challenged this narrative, arguing that the theological and legal systems of Islam were fully operational during this era. Islamic courts were functional, the law was being applied, and the core creed remained intact. The decay was confined to a specific failure of political governance, not the faith itself. Hussain directed his resistance toward a highly specific structural shift in state power, treating the conflict as a constitutional crisis rather than a theological revival. Al-Masjid an-Nabawi in Medina served as the locus of the Khilafat-e-Rashida, a state defined by the principle of consultative leadership. The departure from this original consultative model occurred 20 years before the events at Karbala. The transition reached its terminal phase when the Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah bypassed the consultative process to nominate his son Yazid as his successor. Understanding why this shift triggered a crisis requires an analysis of Quranic linguistics, state structures, and the subversion tactics used to destabilize the early Muslim community. By stripping away the poetic tragedy, we can examine the 7th century as a study in political mechanics and state survival. Early Quranic manuscripts distinguish between the general act of dying in combat and a more specific theological mandate. The baseline for a soldier killed on the battlefield is maqtul fi sabil Allah. The term shahadat carries a different epistemic weight entirely. A shaheed is effectively a prosecution witness. This role requires the individual to provide a living testimony to the truth through their speech, their public actions, and their refusal to comply with systemic corruption. Hussein's objective at Karbala was to provide this witness. He was acting as a constitutional observer, documenting a betrayal of the state's original principles through his own presence and sacrifice. This legal framework redefines the events at Karbala. It was not a military campaign, but a formal theological witnessing against a mutating political system. To visualize this, consider Shah Ismail Shahid's metaphor of a 6-story building representing the Islamic social order. The foundational 5 floors, ethics, law, theology, judiciary, were structurally sound. The collapse was restricted to the 6th floor, the Caliphate. It was replaced by Malukiyat, a hereditary monarchy. Many companions accepted this replacement as a pragmatic necessity to prevent internal warfare. Their judgment prioritized the survival of the bottom 5 floors over the ideal integrity of the 6th. Hussein's resistance focused specifically on this architectural swap. He argued that a system with a compromised apex would eventually see its foundations crumble as well. Damascus became the administrative hub of this new hereditary state. However, the political transition was complicated by a macro environment of systemic subversion. The Sabai movement operated as a destabilization network, injecting misinformation across Medina, Kufa, and Damascus to keep the state in perpetual friction. These operatives revived pre-Islamic tribalism, forcing the political conversation back to a binary rivalry between Banu Hashim and Banu Umayyah. Abdullah ibn Omar and Ibn Abbas viewed the Sabai network as a terminal threat. They calculated that any move to challenge the monarchy would trigger a civil war that the subversives would use to destroy the entire building. Hussein and Abdullah ibn Zubair reached the opposite conclusion. They viewed the normalization of monarchy as a slow-motion collapse that required an immediate, visible check. These were not petty disputes over power, but a geopolitical crisis where different leaders employed competing strategies to preserve the state's survival. Hussein's move toward Kufa was based on tangible intelligence, receiving thousands of written pledges of support to restore the consultative system. But Kufan governor Aden Ziyad responded with a swift crackdown. The support network evaporated under state force, leaving Hussein operationally stranded. In the 7th century, the political concept of a loyal opposition did not exist. Without a distinction between the government and the state, dissent was legally classified as treason. This lethal legal taxonomy allowed the state to issue a fatwa authorizing Hussein's death. Hussein was trapped by Kufan betrayal and a legal system that viewed his call for consultation as a capital offense. Centuries later, Karbala persists as a benchmark for human resilience and the willingness to withstand systemic pressure. This legacy is most visible today through massive emotional rituals of grief. Dr. Isra Ahmad's analysis suggests that by focusing exclusively on the poetic tragedy, we overlook Hussein's actual operational objective. Modern communities have preserved the emotional memory of the sacrifice, while moving further away from the rigorous political model Hussein died to defend. Hussein's objective remained structural. He targeted the collapsed sixth floor of the state, aiming to restore the consultative integrity of the political system through his own presence and testimony. This structural blueprint defines the modern Muslim obligation. If the six-story building is the goal of Islamic political theory, then the stability of the entire system depends on the integrity of its governance. The inheritance of Karbala is the intellectual demand to look past the ritual and address the architecture of the state. It is a mandate to move from the passive mourning of a tragedy to the active construction of just systems.